It never occurred to me that it was a big deal. What occurred to me was that the proposed policy was just fabulously stupid. I think it was the term I used in the House, and so that was what was engaging my attention. How could we do something so criminally stupid?
My name is Jonny Ball, and I'm the founder of Campaign Force, a not-for-profit that inspires, trains, and coaches the armed forces community to stand up and serve again. I've served on the front line of military operations and in civilian life, the front line of UK politics. This Veterans in Politics podcast is a set of interviews brought to you by Campaign Force and sets out to explore how the military community can help make our politics a better place. I lean into my little black book of contacts and sit down with individuals from across the world of politics, sharing secrets, giving tips and advice, and inspiring the next generation. We are Campaign Force. This is the Veterans in Politics podcast. Let's introduce you to our guest.
Crispin Blunt MP is from a strong military family. From a commission into the cavalry and a subsequent career as a Conservative MP, he paints a perfect picture of a veteran in politics. But Crispin has led an interesting life, dealing with the questions he had over his sexuality to eventually coming out to his wife and family. We explore this in this episode and conclude that he lives his life as a way of paying back to all those who have campaigned before him. In a podcast first, Jonny asked him about the famous Popper's speech, which leads to an interesting discussion on drug reform. You definitely do not want to miss this. It's time for you to meet our guest.
Hello, Crispin. Delighted.
Hi, Jonny.
Hello. Delighted for us to link up today. I've been longing to speak to you for a while now, and it's fantastic that we've got the opportunity to have a chat. But welcome to Veterans in Politics. And of course, you are a veteran in politics. But why on earth did you get involved in politics in the first place?
If I trace it back, it does go back to my sort of military background. My dad was a professional soldier. Actually, you can see him over my it's over my right shoulder, appear over the left shoulder, I think, to the viewer. And he started at the very bottom of the army and got to the top. Both my grandfathers were professional soldiers. One was an ordinary soldier, joined in 1914 at the beginning of the Great War, and ended as a sergeant major instructor at the driving and maintenance school at Bovington for the Royal Tank Corps. And my other grandfather was conventional officer background, Norfolk professional family. I think my great grandfather was a doctor, and he ended as a major general. And by total coincidence, both my father and my maternal grandfather ended up having the same jobs, which was as head of either the Royal Corps of Transport or the what was in my grandfather's day, the Royal Army Service Corps. So there was a little circularity there, and it was almost certainly only my mother's support and guidance and her commitment to the relationship and to her children that then enabled my father to have such an exceptional career of being War Commissioner in 1944, left the army in 46. That's where he met my mother when he was working really for the Foreign Office on the Control Commission in Germany, where my grandfather was then, I think as a retired general, was then running part of the administration of Germany at the time in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And that's where they met, and then they got married in 1949. I'm never entirely sure whether my mother's father was aware that my father's father wasn't actually commissioned, because the marriage certificate actually has an officer's rank of it of captain, and I'm pretty certain my paternal grandfather was never commissioned. But it's obviously a reflection of a kind of hybrid social relationship they had of a day of a sergeant major's son and a general's daughter getting married, which they were a rather perhaps an unusual product of the time. So I grew up with that obviously very military background. and was obviously lucky enough with my dad then serving to be able to be sent to independent boarding school with the allowance that officers receive, or all soldiers receive for educating their children, because obviously they're posted all over the place. At age 7, I went off to school as they went off to Singapore, and age 13 went off to Wellington College. And it's probably, during my time at both schools, I got kind of super interested in wars and tales of daring do and all that sort of thing as with a military background. Then if you like, the politics and the current affairs that surround conflict then became, I suppose, really interesting. And all of that led, that sort of military history and history then led ineluctably, I think, to an interest in current affairs, and from current affairs into politics. And so wanting to be a soldier and being interested in current affairs and being interested in politics ran side by side whilst I was at school. And then kind of by the age of 18, I then made this plan that I would join the army, and then see if I could get the army to send me off to university to study politics. And then if all of that worked, about 10 years later would then be the time to think about whether I still wanted to have a go and see if I could get into politics as a member of parliament. And crudely, 10 years later, I did. So I tried and it worked.
Wow, what a journey, and what a deep-rooted history that your family has within public service of this country. And it seems to me, strikes me in just listening back, that there's a bit of an intertwinement between the military and political life. And would you say that this has had, your own military service has had an impact on your approach to politics and serving again?
Yes, I think so. I think it is that. Obviously, there's plainly an element of it of being wanting to be in the game and then be part of the story. So the interest in history and current affairs, and then how do you get engaged in today's what will be a history of today, and a way of playing a role and being in it is to be a representative, a politician in that way. But there's also heavily intertwined into it that sense of public service. That's come from, I said, I've got a great grandfather who's a doctor. Then on the other side of of my mother's family, her other grandfather was a cleric, was the rector of Colton, who had 4 children by his first wife, and then his wife died. And so, as was the way, and sometimes in those days, the vicar married the housekeeper. The housekeeper then gave birth to my grandmother, aged 50, which is in 1900. Now that's a fairly remarkable story in itself. And she was quite a headstrong child, and I think she ran away in 1919, having fallen in love with my grandfather. At which stage he was stationed in Palestine and Egypt. So she chased him out to the Middle East, where they got married in St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem in 1921. Again, itself a fairly extraordinary story, but it's that's the background, and there's quite a lot of sense of public service in that, and much of the reward of the job does come from helping other people.
Yeah, what an extraordinary story that your family seems to have had, and you've got your own extraordinary story too. And I think that really you are viewed as one of the most senior LGBT figures within politics. First of all, I mean, are you comfortable with that kind of labeling of you as an individual, as I've suggested? And how far do you think we've come in terms of making it easier for people from the LGBT community to think about serving in public life? And do you think your own journeys helped inspire others, be they from the armed forces community or the LGBT community?
I'm not totally comfortable about it, because there are people who have a much more profound contribution that they've made to leadership around LGBT issues, and who have chosen to take the risks of being out, and many other people, both currently in politics, but people who never made it into politics, have paid with their careers, their freedom, sometimes their lives, to be themselves. Now, I grew up, as I think, as you've heard from my background, in a very conventional family in a social sense, and there were no gay role models around. So if I was watching TV, I'd be seeing John Inman and Larry Grayson as the sort of kind of gay things on television, and I'd be going, well, that's not me. Now I do find these things called girls really quite difficult, but boys are totally illegal and social death. Whilst I might have cheerful fantasies about boys' public schools, certainly in my time, extremely homophobic institutions. So the idea that you were going to come to terms with yourself there was be fanciful. So what I understood about myself was there was something wrong with me. And then eventually, almost at the end of my time at university, I was successfully seduced by a girl who fancied me, and I had discovered sex, and it was a hell of a lot better than no sex. And so there was a kind of few. I've cracked that response to it, because the alternative was not, in that sense, socially available. It would have been illegal because I was at the time as a soldier. So it's just really not to be contemplated. It just had to get. That part of me just had to get buried. But of course, as a consequence of managing in that way, and I then didn't do what other people had done, which was, I kept my career, I kept my job. I was able to become a politician because, as the chairman of my association I think the then chairman in 2001, when Alan Duncan, who was the first Conservative MP to come out, my then association observed, well, we would never have selected him here. We have a nice family man. And you can imagine at that point what, and by that stage, I was beginning to come to terms with myself, with actually the working environment in Parliament was so much more gay friendly than anything I had ever come across before. And I was beginning to ask myself some fundamental questions about what was the truth about me. And that was when, if you like, the social construct I'd built around myself then began to unravel.
Well, it's really generous of you to share that very personal story, and listening it from you has certainly touched me, just, as a human, listening to that. And I'm sure our listeners will be thankful for how you.
Well, except, of course, I hadn't paid with my job. I hadn't paid with my liberty. I hadn't paid with my life, which some people have who had led in this way. And so I was able to come out in 2010, when the decision at that point was simply to tell my wife, and then what followed, because plainly I was then going to be a separated man serving my constituents, and people might obviously plainly begin to wonder why my wife wasn't then attending events with me. There's obviously the difficulty of addressing the end of the practical end of the marriage, which is obviously traumatic itself personally. So that was a statement was made. I was lucky enough not to be, if you like, outed by a newspaper in a way that one of my colleagues was, who had followed exactly the same path in terms of telling his wife, just didn't make it public, and then was trying to live his new free life, and was done in a newspaper sting. Now, by the time I did it, some of the reaction was, well, why do we need to know about this? Why is this news? And that was a reflection of the change in situation, the change in 2010. And so part of my work now, and after I left the government in 2012, is then my work in politics is to repay the contribution that British LGBT leaders made in changing British society in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the sacrifices they made, which I didn't. Now there are many parts of the world where Britain was on that journey back in the 1950s or 60s or 70s, and I hope that my story can contribute to accelerating progression in those countries for their LGBT communities, and indeed for their whole societies to get healthier by people being able to be themselves.
I certainly think your work will. And do you think that as a result of the work of others, as you've mentioned, and the work that you're doing now, your various campaigns, that it's a far easier place for people in power and positions of leadership to be able to come out? Do you think we've changed much?
Obviously, it is completely different to what it was in when I was growing up. I mean, I was 18 in 1978. Couldn't have contemplated taking the path that I've done. It would have been wholly impossible, and been out to myself, let alone anybody else. I don't think it would have worked, and that's not a healthy place to be. Now, I've been incredibly lucky. I had a conventional life, certainly overtly, until I was 50. I got two wonderful children, and had I come out at age 18, and I would have walked straight into the AIDS plague, and I suspect we wouldn't be having we almost certainly would not. You wouldn't have been able to have a conversation with me now, because too many people of that generation simply didn't make it. So I hope I'm kind of naturally a glass half full person anyway. Reflect back on just how fabulously lucky I've been, and the way the world has changed, so that I've had, if you like, the best of everything, and it's which is why it's kind of very easy to try and I think to give back, because you kind of think I'm in heavy debt to others, and it's good to, and it feels better about then being in a place then to encourage others to be themselves, and to try and open up so far as one can the conversations that will help other societies then and other parliamentarians in other countries understand that sexuality is not a choice, and once you get to that place, then a whole bunch of other things flow from that, and the duty you as a member of parliament owe to the people you represent then mean that you have got to ensure that that if people aren't exercising choice around their sexuality just as much as they do around their colour or their disability or other equality characteristics, you've got a duty to represent them properly.
Well, I think that this conversation we're having today, I hope this will be part of that work. I know for me, the podcasts around mental health have had a profound impact around my own attitudes and dealing with my own mental health. So, and that's the power of this media of podcasts. We can really have these personal conversations in the earbuds of our listeners. And this is what this is all about, to explore, yes, what veterans in politics can really add to our politics and make it a better place, but then also get under the skin of the individuals and the stories and what motivates them themselves. And you've been brave, not only just speaking today to me, but also in the chamber. And probably one of your most famous speeches has been around the government's policy towards amyl nitrate. And having watched that
by design, that speech was made, I think, whilst I was chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and whilst I had by then chaired the Parliamentary Friends of the Kaleidoscope Trust from 2013 to 2015. In 2015, we decided to change that group into an formal all-party parliamentary group for global LGBT rights was the objective. That's what we did. I then got elected as chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, which was a fairly heavy-duty responsibility in Parliament, which would have meant I didn't have the bandwidth to do the APPG properly. But very happily, the first Conservative ever to be selected as an out gay man to be a candidate for Parliament in a winnable seat, Nick Herbert, stepped up to be the first chair of that group. And he's done a fabulous job. He's gone on to be the first, and now he's Lord Herbert. He's now gone on to chair the Global Equality Caucus, which is a new global grouping of LGBT plus parliamentarians. So all of that's going really well. But by 2016, obviously, I was then kind of committed on this part of the equality agenda. I'd also served as a prisons minister. And I had seen just what an utter disaster our drugs policy was in terms of what is happening to the criminal justice system as a consequence of using drug use and drug misuse as a criminal justice issue rather than a public health issue. And so that now, since I stopped being chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, that's now the other, if you like, arm of my work is around drug policy reform. And I suppose the Popper speech just rolled down the track a little bit earlier than I became fully committed and somehow linked the two. And thinking of the timing of this, I think it was in the shortly after the 2015 election, the government started looking at a drugs bill, which was going to lead to the, given the way it was going to classify AMR night traders, they were going to make it illegal. So I had a quiet word with the drugs minister, who looked at me, who was another ex-soldier actually, who then, but not one quite as enlightened as or as liberal as I am, different wing of the party, who then sort of simply said, "Yeah, your lot aren't going to like it." And so I thought, there's not much point continuing the conversation with him. And one of my other colleagues actually did a lot of the groundwork in Parliament, Mike Freer, and doing it properly. And then the Home Affairs Select Committee looked at the issue and they recommended it shouldn't be criminalised, something else. And then we got to the final day, if you like, as the legislation was going through the last gasp of the report stage, when MPs have the opportunity to table amendments in order to change the legislation. And I had actually, I then encouraged my LGBT colleagues to vote against to vote for the amendment, which would have not criminalised it. And then I thought I probably better speak to it. And actually, that speech had about that much preparation. And so I rolled up in the chamber as this amendment was being considered, and kind of getting an off the cuff, I think it was a 5 or 7 minute speech. And it was, to say the least, it wasn't exactly over prepared. And I certainly hadn't considered for a minute that it was then going to lead to me on the front page of the Sun the following day. And I actually closed down any commentary on it as soon as I realised it had gone, it was the typical kind of thing that I probably should have worked out that the media might enjoy it rather more than I had done. And I closed the commentary down. It's kind of knowing in the background that the spines of my poor wretched children were snapping with embarrassment.
Well, for those interested in what we're referring to as the Popper speech, you'll certainly be able to find that on YouTube. And the thing I'm fascinated about is just how you, Crispin, were able to channel any emotions around something so passionate. How do you control and speak about subjects that you're so passionate about? We've seen that in some of the recent veterans that have spoken, whether it be the maiden speeches of Johnny Mercer or Stuart Anderson, and many others, when they're speaking about something that's so personal and so that they're so passionate about. What skills and how do you approach giving, even if it's off the cuff, those kind of speeches in Parliament?
Well, actually, my passion was about the public policy engaged here. It was to some degree something I happen to know about. But there's no big deal. It never occurred to me that it was a big deal. What occurred to me was that the proposed policy was just fabulously stupid. I think it was the term I used in the House, and so that was what was engaging my attention. How could we do something so criminally stupid as then to drive another bunch of people out of obeying the law around our drugs policy? Since I've got into the drug policy reform space, it's become horribly clear to me that almost nobody obeys the law around our drugs policy. I did a debate in the Durham Union Society, speaking alongside the then Chief Constable of the Durham Constabulary, to the freshers at Durham University, about 300 students newly arrived at Durham at this debate, and the Chief Constable asked them how many of them had done illegal drugs. These are 18, 19-year-olds. 80% of them put their hands up. 80% of them confessed to a crime to the Chief Constable. Impressive. But it just shows how much respect there is for our laws out there. And if your laws are in that kind of place, and as we discovered with 100% of the candidates to the Conservative leadership last time around having to explain their previous illegal behaviour, you might just think that there's something wrong with your laws if they are not being obeyed in that way. And you might just want to think that it might be time to recast how we deal with the misuse of drugs in our society. Which is such a blinding glimpse of the obvious for anyone who's engaged in policy in this space, is that the current way of addressing it it simply isn't working and is making the situation a very great deal worse than it needs to be. A very great deal worse than it needs to be. It is positively catastrophic.
Wow. So obviously policy-driven campaigns, but would you describe yourself as a campaigner?
Well, I suppose I am now, in a sense, that as I've taken this stage of my parliamentary and political life, is that you can. I had anticipated when I got elected as chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in 2015 that you probably serve 2 terms, so that would take me through to 2025. That would probably be me done in Parliament, and I could be a grand panjandrum on the parliamentary foreign affairs circuit and chair the committee and try and do a good job overseeing the government's foreign policy and the position of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And 2 years later, I found that my plans had been upended by the Remain Parliament elected unexpectedly in 2017. And I needed to find something else to focus on. And my choice then was to focus on global LGBT rights and drug policy reform, and to channel my efforts actually in terms of original contribution into those 2 areas, whilst obviously trying to sustain an interest in foreign affairs and plainly the duties that are upon any constituency MP to continue to represent their constituents well. But I'm obviously well aware that an interest in controversial areas like drug policy reform is unlikely to advance my ministerial career prospects, but since I assumed they were near zero anyway, it wasn't a great sacrifice.
Brilliant. So I guess, using that military term, no plan survives first contact in terms of when.
Indeed, exactly, precisely. Very good appreciation.
Where you think your career was going, but I guess for the many veterans or even people from the LGBT community or those interested in drug reform that might be listening into this episode of Veterans in Politics, that might be inspired by your approach to campaigning and trying to change things that you're passionate about, what would be a bit of golden advice for those scratching around thinking, do you know what? I'd quite like the sound of this. I'd quite like to get involved in politics myself. Is there a bit of advice that you'd like to impart upon the audience?
Well, if you're interested, go for it. It would be because you'll never, if you don't give it a try, you'll never know as to how far you might have got. And what I think you'll be surprised about is actually just how easy it can be to get on in politics. If you've got a bit of passion and a bit of talent, and you want to get things done, then and you want the privilege of representing people. Now, you've then also got to remember that politics is very largely a team game. And this is perhaps where I'm not as acute as others who have played the team game rather better than I have. So you do have to be able to cooperate with colleagues. You don't get things done generally on your own. You do have to work with others. That's why we have political parties, because you've got to bring like-minded people together, and that requires a deal of cooperation and teamwork. And actually, I had 5 years as an opposition whip, and that's, if you like, that's the kind of Praetorian Guard that's then around the then whoever is the then leader of the Conservative Party. But your job is then to absolutely be the team. You don't speak in the chamber by and large. You sacrifice, if you like, you take that sort of vow of public omerta, so that you're trying to make sure the whole team prospers. And it's kind of a great place to be in the within the whip's office, I think, at any stage, in order to have that sense where your individualism is then kind of properly suppressed, because you're then trying to make work for the success of the whole institution. But I don't know which policy is a bit like cricket. There is room for all sorts of different skill sets and talents, whether it's a droopy left arm spinner who can't field and can't bat, but I can actually bowl rather brilliantly, to the great all rounder, or to the very steady opening bat or steady middle order player. It is a team game.
Or dare I say it, someone from the armed forces
with room for individual talent. So it's at least I hope that metaphor holds.
I think so. So there you go. You heard it first from Crispin today. Just do it. Just get on and do it. Give it a go. And thank you so much for having this conversation today. It's been fascinating. Thank you for being so open and so honest and sharing your story. And I just hope that this has gone on to help others and inspire them to stand up and serve again. Crispin.
Right. I hope, note the tie, note the cushions in the background.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Thanks to our guests, and thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, hit subscribe now. Alternatively, you can support our mission by checking out in the show notes below, where you can rate, donate, or become our mate. Thank you.